No one in the glass atrium of the Evermont Foundation expected that evening's gala to be interrupted by the trembling voice of a 6-year-old girl. The chandeliers burned white above tables dressed in ivory linen. Champagne moved quietly from hand to hand. A pianist near the far wall played something soft and forgettable, the kind of music designed to fill silences without drawing attention to itself. It was a room built for impressions, and everything in it had been arranged to make those impressions flawless. No one standing beneath those lights anticipated that before the night was over, a child clutching a worn, stuffed rabbit would say a single sentence, and every conversation in that room would stop cold. Silas Dermot arrived at 7:45, 12 minutes before the doors were scheduled to close for the welcome remarks. He had changed his shirt 3 times that evening, not out of vanity but because he understood, in the clear-eyed way that comes from years of being looked at sideways, that the wrong detail would invite the wrong reaction. He settled on a dark navy button-down, pressed that morning before his shift ended. His shoes were polished. His jacket was the only one he owned that still fit well across the shoulders. He was 31 years old. He had a face that people might have called handsome if they had looked at it long enough, strong jaw, eyes that stayed steady even when his hands were busy. But most people in rooms like this one did not look long enough. Bonnie walked beside him, her small hand wrapped around 2 of his fingers. She wore a pale blue dress with a white collar, the one she had picked out herself from the closet where her mother's things used to hang. She carried a stuffed rabbit named Button, gray and soft and missing one eye from 2 years of being held too tightly. She was wide-eyed and careful, the way children are when they sense a place is fragile. The Evermont Foundation Gala was, at its core, a celebration. Once a year, the foundation gathered its donors, its board members, and the families whose children had received educational support through its scholarship programs. Silas had received the letter 4 weeks earlier. Bonnie's name was on the list. She had been selected through the foundation's humanitarian priority track, a designation he had not applied for, had not even known existed, until a woman from the foundation's outreach office called him at work one Tuesday afternoon, and explained it quietly, as though she understood it might be hard to hear. He had asked for the evening off. His supervisor at Hargrove Medical Center had said yes without hesitation, which was the kind of thing that happened when a person had spent 3 years being exactly where they were supposed to be. In the car on the way over, Bonnie had pressed her nose to the window and asked if there would be a cake. He told her probably not, but maybe cookies. She accepted this with the gravity of someone making peace with a reasonable compromise. Before they walked through the main doors, Silas crouched down and straightened the collar of her dress. "You doing okay?" he asked. Bonnie nodded, hugging Button tighter. "Then we're fine," he said. "Just stick close. And if you need to leave, you tell me. We don't have to stay for any of it." She looked at him with the particular seriousness of children who have learned to take their fathers at their word. "I want to stay," she said. He stood. He took her hand again. They walked in together. Audrey Constance was 28 years old, and she had spent the last 14 months learning what it felt like to be the youngest CEO in Evermont Foundation's 30-year history. Most days, that felt like standing on a platform that was slightly too narrow, manageable, as long as she did not look down. She stood near the entrance of the atrium in a red dress with a deep V neckline, her hair swept back in a way that suggested she had spent exactly the right amount of time on it. She was speaking with 2 members of the board and a director of a regional hospital network when she noticed the doors open. She did not stop talking. But something in her posture shifted, a barely perceptible adjustment, the kind that happens when a person with finely tuned situational awareness registers something out of place without yet being able to name it. She finished her sentence. She laughed at the right moment. She moved on to the next conversation. Audrey had not come from money. That was a fact she offered carefully in interviews, usually framed as evidence of something: resilience, perspective, understanding of the foundation's mission. What she rarely said out loud was that the absence of money in her childhood had taught her to read rooms the way other people read weather. Quickly. By pattern. All. With a strong preference for accuracy over generosity. She had learned to size up a person in the time it took to cross a room. She had learned that in environments built on perception, a single misaligned detail could cost more than it looked like it should. These were not cruel instincts. They were survival instincts. The distinction mattered less than she told herself it did. Tonight was critical. 3 of the Foundation's largest annual donors were in attendance. The board had been watching her since she took the role. Not hostile, exactly, but attentive in the way older people are attentive towards someone younger who has been trusted with something they consider valuable. She could not afford a disruption. She could not afford anything that looked like a loss of control. She moved through the room with the precision of someone running a very long calculation. She smiled when she needed to. She asked the right questions. She remembered names. When her gaze swept briefly across Silas Dermot and the small girl at his side, she filed them in the part of her mind reserved for details she could not immediately account for. The man's jacket was clean but not current. The child was too young for an event like this. They did not fit the visual grammar of the room. She noted it. She moved on. She did not yet understand what that notation would cost her. Bonnie had been quiet and careful for the better part of an hour. She stood beside her father near the back of the room, while Foundation staff read names and presented certificates, and she listened with the focused attention of a child who had been asked to behave and had decided to take that seriously. Silas kept one hand light on her shoulder. He applauded when others applauded. He smiled when Bonnie's name was called, and she stepped forward to receive a small framed certificate from a woman in a gray suit who called her a remarkable young scholar, a phrase that made Bonnie look up at her father immediately to see if it was true. He nodded, just once. She stood a little straighter. Afterward, the formal portion gave way to the reception, and the room loosened slightly, voices rising, people moving, the pianist transitioning to something lively. A display table near the center of the atrium had been set up to showcase the Foundation's programs. Photographs of scholarship recipients, architectural models of supported school buildings, printed materials on crisp cardstock, held in place by small chrome stands. Bonnie was drawn to it the way children are drawn to things arranged with care, by the miniature quality of the model buildings, by the bright photographs, by the soft spotlight position to make everything glow a little. She had been still for so long. She was 6 years old. The pull was simply stronger than she was. She did not run. She moved quickly, the way children do when they are trying to walk fast, but their legs have their own ideas. She rounded the corner of the table and clipped the edge of a tray a server was carrying, a tray that held 2 glasses of sparkling water and a folded napkin. One glass tipped. Water spread in a slow, clear arc across a corner of the printed materials and the chrome stand at the edge. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. By the standards of actual catastrophe, it was nothing. Bonnie froze. Silas was at her side in 3 steps. He took the damp cloth from the server, who was already apologizing, and pressed it to the wet surface. He kept his voice low and even. "It's okay," he told the server. "My fault for not watching closer." He blotted the surface carefully. He straightened the printed materials. He checked the chrome stand and found it undamaged. "I'm sorry," Bonnie whispered. "It was an accident," he said quietly. "Accidents happen." He set the cloth down and kept his hand gentle on her back. In a different room, in a different context, the moment would have ended there. But several people nearby had turned. A few wore the particular expression, not angry, not genuinely concerned, just aware that something had occurred that did not belong in rooms like this one. There were small smiles. There were glances exchanged, the kind that communicated without words that someone had confirmed what they had already suspected about the sort of person who brought a 6-year-old to a Foundation gala. Bonnie pressed herself against her father's side and gripped Button tighter. Audrey was standing 12 feet away when it happened. She had been half listening to a conversation about projected endowment figures when the sound of liquid hitting the display surface reached her, quiet but distinct, the way small sounds carry across polished floors in high-ceilinged rooms. She turned. She saw the water. She saw the man crouched down, cleaning. She saw the child. She was already moving before she had decided what she was going to say. It was the pressure that moved her. She understood that later, weeks later, lying awake in a room too quiet. It was not malice. It was the accumulated weight of 14 months of holding a position she had not been entirely certain she deserved, and the bottomless fear that one wrong moment, one lapse in the room's perception of her authority, would become the thing that cost her everything she had worked to build. She crossed the floor. The room noticed. That was how she moved. People noticed. She stopped a few feet from Silas. He had straightened by then. He was looking at her with the calm, slightly tired expression of a man who has seen this kind of approach before and already knows approximately how it will sound. "This is a restricted area," Audrey said. Her voice was composed. It was the voice she used in board meetings when she wanted to signal that a decision had already been made. "Reserved for confirmed guests and foundation partners." Silas did not move. "Not for people who do not understand how to conduct themselves in a professional environment," she continued. A few people nearby had gone still. Not conspicuously. They were too polished for that. But the conversations closest to them thinned out. Silas held her gaze. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and unhurried. "My daughter didn't do it on purpose. I already cleaned it up." The simplicity of it seemed to unsettle her. She had expected defensiveness, perhaps, or apology, or the particular collapse people sometimes showed when they realized they had been identified and assessed and found to belong elsewhere. "There are standards," Audrey said, "for events like this. Not every space is open to everyone, regardless of how a person is dressed." The last sentence fell into the room like something dropped from a height. The air changed. It did not move differently. It simply changed quality, the way a room changes after something breaks, when everyone is suddenly aware of the sound they just heard, and choosing whether to acknowledge it. Silas's jaw tightened. It was the only visible sign. His fingers, hanging at his side, pressed once against his palm, then released. His eyes went very dark for just a moment before settling back into something unreadable. He looked down at Bonnie. She was pressed against his leg, her face turned up, her eyes wide and wet at the corners. "Are you okay?" he asked her. "Not the room. Not Audrey." "Sure." She nodded, barely. He did not say anything more to Audrey Constance. He made a quiet decision in the space of 2 seconds. He had made decisions like this before, the kind where you weigh what you want to say against what it will cost the person standing next to you, and you choose the person. It was not a new calculation. It was simply a painful one. He took Bonnie's hand. "Let's head out," he said softly. "We got your certificate. That's what mattered." She did not argue. She let him lead her, her small fingers threaded through his, button tucked under her other arm. The walk toward the exit moved through the full width of the room, which meant it moved through the attention of everyone who had seen what just happened. Some people looked away. One older woman near the bar watched them go with an expression that was not quite pity and not quite outrage, but somewhere between the two. Silas did not look at any of them. He had long ago stopped expecting rooms like this one to correct themselves. The first time a security guard at a medical conference had asked to see his badge twice while waving the person behind him straight through, he had felt the particular sting of it. By the third or fourth time, it had become something else. Not numbness exactly, but a kind of practiced distance. He knew what he was walking through. He chose not to let it determine the amount of oxygen in his lungs. But tonight was different. Tonight, Bonnie was with him, and Bonnie had heard every word. There was a memory, brief and unwilled, of a different corridor 2 years earlier. a door handle in his hand at 3 in the morning. The look on a nurse's face before she had to say anything at all. He had learned something about distance that night that made everything after feel like a variation on the same lesson. He pressed that memory back down. They were almost at the door. 6 more steps, perhaps. Somewhere behind him, he heard a pause in the room's conversation that was different from the others, heavier, more deliberate. He did not turn. He had almost reached the exit when a familiar voice said his name, just his last name spoken with the specific weight of someone who means it. He turned, slightly, and saw Dr. Ellison standing near the interior corridor, a phone in his hand and an expression that Silas recognized immediately. He had seen it in hallways. He had seen it on faces in the intensive care unit when something bad had been narrowly averted. Dr. Ellison was already moving toward him. Silas met his eyes and gave the smallest possible shake of his head. One movement. Nearly invisible. The doctor stopped. He stood very still, holding Silas's gaze, and then he nodded. Slowly, with a heaviness that said he understood but did not like it. His expression shifted into something quieter. Something that looked, from a distance, like grief wrapped around respect. A board member near the champagne table had been watching the exchange. She looked from the doctor to Silas, then to the folder in her assistant's hands, and asked something in a low voice. Her assistant bent over the folder and began to page through it. Across the room, Audrey Constance noticed. She could not hear it. She could not see the folder clearly, but she could see Dr. Ellison's face, and she had known him long enough to understand that the expression on it right now was not one he wore lightly. Something shifted in her chest. Small and uncomfortable. Like the first indication that a calculation has an error in it somewhere. She turned back to her conversation. She did not hear the next 3 sentences anyone said to her. Bonnie stopped walking. Silas felt it first, the subtle resistance in her hand, the slight drag of her steps on the polished floor. He looked down. She had turned around. Her face was very still in the way that small children's faces go still just before they do something they have decided to do and cannot be talked out of. Her eyes were dry, but only barely. Her chin had that particular set to it he had learned to recognize over 6 years. The look she had at 2 when she refused to stop trying to climb the bookshelf, and at 4 when she told her daycare teacher in a clear, direct voice that she had gotten her friend's name wrong. "Bonnie," he said quietly. She looked up at him. Something in his face must have told her she had approximately 3 seconds before he would pick her up and carry her out, because she turned and walked 3 steps back toward Audrey Constance. Not running, not dramatic, just moving with the steady, deliberate pace of someone who has something to say and has already decided the cost is worth it. She stopped in front of Audrey. She was small. The top of her head barely reached the woman's shoulder. She held Button against her chest with both arms, the way she held him when something frightened her. Her lips pressed together for a moment. Then she said, in a voice that was quiet but entirely clear, "Please don't talk to my dad like that." The conversations immediately around them stopped one by one, like lights going out in a building. Bonnie took a breath. "My dad doesn't bother anybody." Her voice was steady, though her lower lip had begun to tremble at the corners. "He's never bothered anybody in his whole life." She paused. What came next was not something she had prepared. It was simply something she knew. The way children know things they have absorbed without fully understanding them. Things that live in the body before they arrive in language. "My dad stayed at the hospital all night to fix the breathing machines for sick people." Her voice dropped a little. "He stayed all night, and my mom was there too, and he couldn't—" She stopped. She swallowed. He couldn't get to her in time. She looked straight at Audrey. "He's the best person I know." No one spoke. The pianist had not stopped. The music continued somewhere in the background, faint and meaningless now, like sound from another room in a house where something important has just happened. A server near the display table stood with both hands at his sides. The board member who had been paging through the folder had gone completely still. 3 conversations at 3 different tables had simply ceased to exist. Audrey Constance stood with her weight slightly forward and her mouth very slightly open, and she looked at this small child in a pale blue dress holding a worn stuffed rabbit, and she felt something happen inside her chest that she did not have the vocabulary for in that moment. Behind Bonnie, Silas had walked the 3 steps back. He crouched to her level. His face was careful and private in the way faces are when a person is holding something very large very still. "Come here," he said softly. Bonnie turned and went to him. He held her. Above her head, his eyes were closed for exactly 3 seconds. Then he stood. Dr. Ellison moved then. He crossed the room with the unhurried certainty of a man who has already made a decision and is simply executing it. He was in his 60s, gray-haired, with the kind of quietness that tends to develop in people who have spent decades in rooms where everything is urgent, and most of it cannot wait. He stopped a few feet from Audrey and spoke with enough clarity that the people nearest to them could hear without straining. "The little girl is right," he said. He did not look at Silas first. He addressed the room. "His name is Silas Dermott. He works in biomedical engineering and life support systems maintenance at Hargrove Medical Center. He has been there for 3 years. He paused. 2.5 years ago, in September, a major storm made landfall and knocked out primary and secondary power to the eastern grid. Hargrove lost its main generator sequence at 11:47 at night. A few people at the edges of the room had turned fully. Others had moved slightly closer without realizing they were doing it. We had 41 patients on active life support at the time of the outage, Dr. Ellison continued. Manual override requires physical operation of each unit in sequence, in coordination with the floor teams, within a window of about 4 minutes before clinical decline begins. Our automated failover had a conflict in the switching architecture that none of our contracted technicians could resolve in time. He looked at Silas then, briefly, with something in his face that was more than professional regard. Silas was working the night shift. He had his portable diagnostic kit on him because he had been performing a routine audit of the South Wing units earlier that evening. He identified the conflict in the switching architecture in under 3 minutes, implemented a manual bypass, and coordinated with our floor teams to maintain continuity across all 41 units through a 6-hour outage. Not one patient on life support was lost. The room held a silence that was different from before. Before, it had been the silence of people deciding whether to pay attention. Now it was the silence of people who were paying attention and did not know what to do with what they were hearing. "The hospital wanted to recognize him publicly," Dr. Ellison said. He declined. The doctor paused, and for just a moment his voice lost its clinical precision. He said he did not want to make a family tragedy into a press release. He stopped. The board member with the folder spoke quietly to her assistant, who nodded once. "The application for Bonnie Dermott's scholarship," the board member said, "to no one in particular, was submitted through the hospital's humanitarian priority designation. The supporting documentation was—" she paused. It was thorough. Silas was standing with Bonnie's hand in his, looking at the floor near the door, and his expression was the expression of a man who is very tired and would very much like to be somewhere smaller and quieter and more honest than this room. He had not asked for any of this. He had never asked for any of it, not the recognition after the storm, not the letter from the foundation, not the slow accumulation of other people's gratitude. He went to work. He came home. He made dinner and helped with the letters of the alphabet, and sat beside Bonnie's bed on the nights when she could not sleep, and told her stories about a rabbit who knew how to fix broken things. That was the whole of it. That was enough. The people who had been watching Silas with the particular sideways attention of those who have decided someone does not belong now found other things to look at. It was not a dramatic shift. No one announced anything. No one made a gesture of obvious correction. People in rooms like this one rarely do. They simply adjusted. The man who had made a small sound of amusement when Bonnie spilled the water turned toward the far wall and became very interested in the floral arrangement there. A woman who had exchanged a knowing look with her companion at the moment of Audrey's remarks now set down her glass and did not pick it up again. The overall density of the air near that part of the room changed in the way it changes when a collective understanding has arrived, and no one wants to be seen arriving at it too late. Silas did not look at any of them. He did not scan the room for the satisfaction of watching people recalibrate. He did not straighten or lift his chin in the way of a person claiming a moment. He had spent enough years being unseen to understand that visibility cuts both ways, and he wanted neither the wound of the first kind nor the theater of the second. He looked at his daughter. "Ready?" he said. Bonnie looked up at him. She had button tucked under one arm and her certificate rolled in her other hand. She had picked it up from near the display table at some point, quietly, in the way she handled things she considered important. "I want cookies," she said. Something in his face, just for a moment, came loose from the careful stillness it had been holding all evening. Not a smile exactly. Something smaller and more private. Something that lived in the corners of the eyes. "We'll find some on the way home," he said. He turned toward the exit. "Mr. Dermot." Audrey's voice. He stopped. He did not turn right away. He gave himself a moment, not for composure, which he already had, but out of the particular caution of a person who has been in situations like this before, and knows that what comes next determines whether the evening ends with something real or something performed. Then he turned. She was standing in the same spot where she had said the thing she had said, but she was not the same person who had said it. The precision was still there, the posture, the dress, the composure she had built over years of needing it. But something beneath all of it had shifted in a way that no amount of professional maintenance could fully conceal. Her eyes had that quality that eyes get when a person has been surprised by their own capacity for error, and has not yet found a way to explain it away. She was not performing. That much, Silas could see clearly. "I owe you an apology," she said. Her voice was lower than it had been an hour ago. "I spoke to you in a way that was wrong." "In front of your daughter." She glanced at Bonnie, briefly, with an expression that held something genuine. That was wrong. She said it without hedging. Without the cushioning language people reach for when they want credit for the apology without fully accepting the weight of what they are apologizing for. Silas held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said, "You don't owe me a speech. You don't owe me anything in front of this room." His voice was even and unhurried. "Just next time, before you decide what kind of person is standing in front of you, take a little longer. People are more than what you can see in the first 10 seconds. Audrey said nothing. There was nothing to say. He had not left an opening for defense or elaboration. He had simply said the true thing and set it down like something placed on a table and not picked up again. He turned, took Bonnie's hand, and they walked out into the cool of the night. 4 days later, Audrey Constance drove to Hargrove Medical Center alone. No driver. No assistant. No prepared remarks. She sat in the parking structure for 8 minutes before getting out of the car, which was not something she typically did. She was not someone who needed 8 minutes to collect herself before walking into a building. But this was not a building she had walked into before, and the person she was walking in to see had not invited her. She carried a small paper bag. Inside, a set of watercolor paints with a wooden lid and real brushes, the kind a 6-year-old could use and feel the quality of. And an envelope, sealed, with a letter she had written by hand on a Tuesday night when she could not sleep, sitting at her kitchen table, with only the light above the sink on. She had written it 3 times. The first version explained herself. She had thrown it away. The second version apologized in detail. She threw that one away as well. The third version said, "I was wrong. You and your daughter deserved better. I'm sorry." There was more, not much, but honest. She had folded it carefully and sealed it before she could begin it again. The woman at the front desk called back to the technical services wing. A few minutes passed. Then Silas came around the corner, still in his work clothes, dark pants, a gray facility shirt with his name on the left chest pocket. He stopped when he saw her. His expression did not change much. But his shoulders, she noticed, did not tighten the way they had the other night. He was on his own ground. "Miss Constance," he said. "I should have called first," she said. "I wasn't sure you'd answer." He considered that. Probably fair. A small beat passed between them. "I brought something for Bonnie," she said, holding out the bag. "And a letter. For you." She paused. "You don't have to read it." He took the bag. He turned it over once in his hands and looked at the watercolor set through the clear panel on the side of the packaging, and something moved through his face too quickly to name. "She'll like this," he said quietly. He did not say anything else right away. They were standing in a corridor off the main reception area. Clean linoleum, the soft hum of the facility systems, the distant quiet of a building that takes its work seriously. A nurse passed by and nodded at Silas with the easy familiarity of someone who has passed him in this hallway many hundreds of times. An older patient in a wheelchair offered him a small wave from down the hall, and Silas raised 2 fingers in response. A gesture so practiced and natural that Audrey understood, without needing to be told, that this was what it looked like when a person genuinely belonged somewhere. He did not belong in that gala. She had been right about that in the narrow factual sense. He did not belong there the way a person belongs to a room they have been designed for. He belonged here, where the work was real, and the hours were long, and the floor was not polished to make an impression on anyone. "The foundation confirmed Bonnie's enrollment in the full support program," Audrey said. 3 years of funding. I wanted you to hear it directly." He nodded. "I got the letter." Another pause. Not awkward exactly, but careful. The kind that forms between 2 people who have met only in the context of an injury and are now standing on the other side of it, trying to find the dimensions of whatever this is. "I'm not here to make this easier for myself," she said. "I wanted you to know that I understand what I did, not just to you, to Bonnie, to what she had to do that night." She stopped herself. She should not have had to do that. Silas looked at her for a long moment. "No," he agreed. "She shouldn't have." He let that sit. Then, quietly, "But she did it because she loves her dad. I'm not going to take that away from her by being angry about the reason." Something in Audrey's face shifted. She had not expected that, the way he held both things at once, what was wrong and what had come from love, without needing the first to cancel the second. She nodded. She did not say anything more, because there was nothing more that would not diminish it. Bonnie appeared at the end of the corridor. She had been in the small family waiting area just around the corner. There was a play table there, and a plastic bin of picture books, and Silas sometimes brought her in for the last hour of his Thursday shift when his neighbor, Mrs. Galloway, had a church commitment. Bonnie saw the bag first. She looked at Audrey with the precise, unguarded wariness of a child who remembers exactly who this person is and has not yet decided whether to update that file. "That's for you," Silas said. "From Miss Constance." Bonnie approached slowly. She took the bag. She opened it and pulled the watercolor set out with both hands, turned it over, examined the brushes through the cellophane with the focused attention of someone who takes art supplies seriously. Then she looked at Audrey. "Are you the one who was mean to my dad?" she asked. There was a silence. "Yes," Audrey said. Bonnie considered this. "Are you sorry?" "I am," Audrey said. "Very." Another pause. "Okay," Bonnie said. She looked at the paints again. "These are the good kind." She turned and went back to the waiting area with her paints. Silas exhaled. It was barely audible. Audrey looked at him, and he looked at her, and for the first time since the night of the gala, something in the space between them felt not resolved, because the things that happen between people are rarely fully resolved, only grown around, but honest. Emptied of performance. Two people standing in a plain corridor without chandeliers or champagne, or the pressure of 100 observers. "Thank you for coming," he said. It was not a polite thing. He meant it. "Thank you for giving me the chance to," she said. She left a few minutes later. Silas went back around the corner, where Bonnie was already pulling the brushes out of the case and laying them in a row on the low table, most to Lee's favorite, by some system of her own devising, with Button propped against the plastic bin as audience. He sat down on the bench beside her. The late afternoon light came through the long window at the end of the corridor, pale and amber, the kind that arrives without announcement and does not stay long. It moved across the floor in a slow, unhurried way. Outside, the city was doing what cities do in the quiet hours before evening, shifting weight, breathing differently, making room for what comes next. Bonnie chose a brush. She opened the wooden lid of the paint set. She looked up at her father. "Can I paint anything I want?" "Anything you want," he said. She thought about it with great seriousness for a moment. "I'm going to paint Button." "Good choice," he said. She turned back to the paints. And Silas Dermot sat beside his daughter in the fading afternoon light, in the building where he belonged, and was quiet in the way of a person who has nothing left to prove. He had not won anything that night at the gala in the way that word is usually meant. No title reclaimed, no position secured, no public acknowledgement that he was owed. What had happened was something quieter and more durable than winning. He had been seen. Not by everyone. Not even by most of the people in that room. But by the ones who mattered, and by himself, and by his daughter, who had stood up in a room full of strangers and said, "My father is good." That was not a small thing. It would not fix everything. The next time he walked into a room that looked like that one, someone would still find a way to look through him. He understood that. He had always understood that. The world does not reform itself around a single evening. But Bonnie had her paints. And she would grow up knowing that her father had stood still under pressure that would have bent other men, and had not bent. And that this, more than any record the hospital kept, more than any story anyone might tell about a storm and a generator, and 41 machines that kept on running through the dark, was the thing most worth knowing about. And somewhere across the city, a young CEO sat at her kitchen table, in the silence, after something that had cracked something open in her, and for once did not immediately fill the silence with work, or planning, or the maintenance of the version of herself she had spent years constructing. She just sat with it. That, too, was a beginning.